October Revolution. Despite being so well known, many of its causes are often overlooked. The World War I is often cited as a major reason, it's not often elaborated on how. Today, we will be exploring how World War I significantly accelerated the October Revolution by straining Russia's already struggling manufacturing and food industries, as well as the sheer number of Russian losses from the war. Before we actually delve into any of the reasons, it is very important to get a grasp on what was happening during this time period. In the early to mid-1910s, tensions in Europe were at an all-time high, where a single spark could send the entire continent into war. This spark came in 1914 when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot, snowballing the entire continent into war against each other. France, Britain, Russia, Serbia, and later on Italy, and the Entente, or Allies, and Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans, and the Central Powers opposing the Entente. By 1917, Germany had occupied a large amount of territory throughout the Eastern Front. Russia's industry was far behind the rest of Europe's, making most manufactured goods take longer and cost more to produce. The onset of World War I created a very large need for weapons in the army, of which the current industry simply could not produce. Russia tried to solve this problem by overworking its workers. Shifts became more intense, longer, and injuries from working skyrocketed. Workers became discontent with the conditions, which eventually led to many protests. The Bolshevik Party's main standing ground was workers' rights, so they appealed to the workers who didn't like their current conditions. The Bolsheviks noticed this and kept advertising to workers as well as organizing strikes and protests. First, let's look at this poster. Here we see a social pyramid. The people at the lower end of the pyramid look completely miserable. They all appear to be very slim, as if they are starving. We even see some of them begging the upper classes for money. But if you look at the upper parts of the pyramid, we see that most of them are fat and do not seem miserable at all. Some of them even appear to be laughing. On top of that, we see many people of the upper classes disrespecting or even harming people which appear to be at the lower class. Now, though serfdom and feudalism were long since abolished in Russia, that poster seems to indicate that feudalism simply just evolved and got a new name: capitalism. It's quite important to note that capitalism is quite a broad category, so different countries and time periods had their own versions. In Russia in the early 1900s was very similar to feudalism. As shown on this poster, this economic system came with heavy class division. Many of the lower classes struggled with basic necessities, while the upper classes had it all, creating resentment and gave people a reason to participate in a revolution, which gave the Bolsheviks many more people in their ranks. Let's look at this photograph for a second. Here, we see what appears to be Lenin giving a speech to a crowd. But ignore Lenin and take a good look at the crowd. Though they may appear to be soldiers, and some may be, the majority of the crowd are actually factory workers. This proves that Lenin advertised the factory workers of Russia. When we pair this information with the earlier information about class division, we can now see why so many people went to the Bolshevik Party. The war strained the food industry quite heavily for two main reasons. First off, many of Russia's soldiers were originally farmers, which decreased the amount of laborers in farms. Second, the war made a large amount of farmland unusable for Russia due to occupation and/or gas attacks. Combining a lack of workers with a lack of land, food became much more scarce. Let's take a look at this picture. At first glance, you probably can't understand what it means at all. But luckily for you, I decided to translate it. Now, if we take another look at this with the translations, we can read that the first banner, the large one, says increased rations for soldiers' families, defenders of freedom, and the people's peace. While the banner in the back says feed the children of the defenders of the motherland. This specifically relates to the Soviets because of the April Theses. The April Theses is the origin of the peace, land, and bread chant that you may or may not know about. This chant was the promises Lenin gave to the Russian people if he were to take charge. And now we see how Lenin specifically advertised food to starving people, which drastically raised their numbers as many people wanted to escape the starvation. It's probably not very surprising when I say that many Russian soldiers died from World War I. But the actual numbers are shocking. 5.5 million soldiers were killed or injured out of Russia's 16 million. That's roughly 34% of their soldiers killed or injured. But that's not all. Roughly 3 million Russian soldiers were taken as POWs. Adding these numbers together show us that 8.5 million soldiers were killed, injured, or taken as POWs by 1917. That's over half of Russia's total 16 million. If we simulated this in a room of 30 people, only 14 would still remain. Now, taking these losses into account, we can see that the war had a mental toll on soldiers as well as their family and friends. With losses so high, the patriotism originally seen at the beginning of the war faded away and was replaced with large-scale war exhaustion. Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, also opposed the war. As a result, many of his promises reflected this. The main one being, once again, peace, land, and bread. This greatly boosted popular support for the Soviets, as well as creating a sense of urgency within the Soviet leadership to launch the revolution before the end of the war, as that was likely when their support would be at its peak. Now, we see how World War I increased support for the Soviet Party in 3 separate ways at once, as well as giving leadership a reason to launch the revolution early. All of these factors came together and accelerated the October Revolution so that it happened in 1917 instead of later. Some people think that without World War I, the October Revolution may have never even happened. The only problem with arguing that is that it gets too much into predictions and less on actual evidence. This information may seem completely useless to you, but I guarantee you it is not. It's a common saying that history always repeats itself, and that is absolutely true. We see similar events all over the world throughout all of history. Although I wish I could cover all of these similar revolutions, I simply cannot do so without gross oversimplification in such a short video. The main thing I want you to take away from this is that war could drastically amplify already existing problems, as well as making new problems in a country to the point of revolution. And with that being said, I hope you understand the Russian Revolution, as well as why it's important to learn about.